Montana lawmakers urging the Bureau of Land Management to block changes made to grazing permits requested by the American Prairie Reserve.
What you just saw wasn't science fiction. In 2005, America actually released 16 bison into Montana's Barren Plains after an absence of more than 120 years, a decision that seemed completely impossible to most people watching.
That's why there has been a push to restore the bison population here in Phillips County. However, not everyone is in support.
Montana Stockgrowers Association called it a useless takeover. Local ranchers warned it would destroy their way of life.
We reintroduced bison back in 2005 because they're a key part of this ecosystem, these grasslands.
Critics laughed at what seemed like a desperate, misguided effort by elite donors with too much money. United Property Owners of Montana dismissed the entire project as an assault on business and culture. For years, ranchers pointed to the threats to cattle operations and mocked the vision of an American Serengeti as pure fantasy. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was taking shape, quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. And now, nearly 20 years later, those same critics regretted it. Because what happened next shocked wildlife experts across the nation.
Bison are what we call an ecosystem engineer.
To understand how 16 bison transformed 3.2 million acres of Montana prairie, we need to go back to October 20th, 2005. On a cold and rainy night, not long past midnight, American Prairie Reserve staff watched as 16 bison stepped back onto the Montana prairie. These weren't just any bison. They came from Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, descendants of one of the last wild herds in North America. The grasslands stretched endlessly in every direction, barren of the massive herds that once thundered across these plains. For more than 120 years, not a single wild bison had grazed this land. This wasn't just an environmental experiment. It was an attempt to resurrect an entire ecosystem that had been declared dead. Welcome to Forgotten Lands, where we uncover the impossible transformations that changed everything. The story of why these plains became barren begins with one of the most devastating ecological collapses in American history. In the 1800s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed the Great Plains, creating one of the most spectacular wildlife displays on Earth. Their hooves aerated the soil, their grazing patterns created diverse plant communities, and their wallows became seasonal wetlands that supported countless other species. But by 1884, the slaughter was nearly complete. Commercial hunters, supported by the U.S. government's policy to starve Native American tribes into submission, had reduced the vast herds to fewer than 1,000 animals nationwide. The Montana plains, once black with bison as far as the eye could see, became empty grasslands where cattle now grazed in neat, orderly patterns. For over a century, ranchers built their lives and livelihoods on these converted grasslands. They developed water systems, fencing, and grazing rotations perfectly suited for cattle. The idea that wild bison could return seemed not just impractical, but insulting to generations of families who had made the land productive. When American Prairie Reserve announced their vision in the early 2000s, the reaction was swift and brutal. Deanna Robbins, a third-generation Montana rancher and leader of the Save the Cowboy movement, didn't mince words. "We don't just occupy this land. Our life's work is growing food, and this is a hungry world." She viewed the Bison Project as basically a takeover of this area by just a few individuals with vast financial resources. The Montana Stockgrowers Association went further, calling it a threat to the entire ranching economy. Local newspapers ran editorials questioning why outside money was being used to play God with working landscapes. Critics pointed out that wild bison would bring predators like wolves and grizzly bears, creating competition for grass and threatening cattle operations. Even some conservationists were skeptical. The scale seemed impossible. American Prairie Reserve was talking about assembling 3.2 million acres, an area larger than Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks combined. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming, and the opposition was fierce and well-organized. But on that cold October night in 2005, the first 16 bison stepped off the transport trucks anyway. Several were pregnant cows, and American Prairie staff held their breath, wondering if these animals could adapt to their ancestral home after more than a century of absence. If you're amazed by this story of bringing an extinct ecosystem back to life, comment bison below and let me know what you think about rewilding projects like this one. The early years were anything but smooth. The 16 bison had to adapt to harsh Montana winters, predators, and grasslands that had been shaped by cattle grazing for generations. Critics watched closely, waiting for signs of failure. Some ranchers openly hoped the experiment would collapse, proving their point that the land was better suited for livestock. But something remarkable began to happen. In April 2006, 5 bison calves were born on the prairie, the first wild bison births in Montana in over 120 years. The mothers, descendants of the last wild herds, seemed to remember instincts that had been dormant for generations. They knew how to find shelter in coulees during blizzards, how to use their massive heads to sweep snow away from grass, and how to navigate the complex social dynamics of herd life. American Prairie Reserve continued adding animals carefully and strategically. In 2006, they brought 20 more bison from Wind Cave. In 2007, another 22 arrived. By 2008, they had added 10 bison from the Nature Conservancy's Broken Kettle Grasslands Preserve in Iowa. Each addition was planned to maximize genetic diversity and herd health. The real game changer came in 2010, when 93 bison arrived from Elk Island National Park in Alberta, Canada. These animals carried special significance. Their ancestors were part of the Pablo herd, the largest bison herd left in North America in the early 1900s. The Pablo herd had originally roamed Montana before being sold to the Canadian government in 1907. Now, more than a century later, their descendants were coming home. As the herd grew, so did the controversy. Ranchers filed lawsuits, lobbied politicians, and organized opposition groups. The Montana Attorney General and Governor's Office joined legal challenges. The phrase, American Serengeti, became a rallying cry for opponents who saw it as evidence of outsiders imposing their vision on working communities. Deanna Robbins intensified her Save the Cowboy campaign, arguing that the project would wipe out the surrounding vibrant, healthy communities of family ranches and the local cowboy culture. She warned that wild species like grizzly bears, wolves, and free-roaming bison would threaten cattle on neighboring properties, while elk and deer would create competition for grass and forage. The opposition seemed to have momentum. Local newspapers ran stories about the threat to traditional ways of life. Politicians promised to fight the outside takeover. Some ranchers refused to sell to American Prairie Reserve at any price, viewing it as a betrayal of their heritage. But while the critics organized and protested, the bison were quietly transforming the landscape in ways no one had anticipated. The changes started small but accelerated rapidly. Bison graze differently than cattle. They move in large groups, creating a mosaic of heavily grazed areas and ungrazed refuges. Their hooves, evolved over millions of years on these exact grasslands, created different soil conditions than cattle hooves. Their wallowing behavior, rolling in dirt to remove insects and shed winter coats, created depressions that collected rainwater and became seasonal wetlands. These seemingly minor differences had cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. Native plant species that had been suppressed for over a century began to reappear. Prairie dogs, whose colonies had been systematically destroyed by ranchers, found new habitat in areas where bison grazing created the short grass conditions they preferred. Birds that hadn't been seen in the region for decades began returning. Burrowing owls, mountain plovers, and ferruginous hawks found the diverse habitat structure created by bison grazing. Elk and pronghorn populations increased as the varied grazing patterns created better forage conditions. By 2014, American Prairie Reserve had reintroduced over 300 bison from multiple sources, creating a genetically diverse herd that was thriving in conditions that critics had claimed were unsuitable. The animals were not just surviving, they were reshaping the entire ecosystem. If this story is inspiring you to think differently about conservation and rewilding, hit that like button and subscribe to Forgotten Lands for more stories of impossible transformations that changed the world. The real vindication came in 2022, when the Bureau of Land Management completed a comprehensive environmental analysis of American Prairie Reserve's proposal to graze bison on 63,500 acres of federal public lands. After years of study and thousands of public comments, the BLM reached a stunning conclusion. The bison project would have no significant impact on the land or local cattle ranching economy. More than that, the analysis predicted the decision would actually benefit local wildlife, improve land and water quality, and create new jobs in the region. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. Bison were not destroying the landscape, They were restoring it to a more natural and resilient state. The transformation extended far beyond ecology. American Prairie Reserve partnered with the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation to develop ecotourism opportunities, creating jobs for cultural interpretive guides, naturalists, caterers, and photographers. The organization began distributing surplus bison to tribal herds across the Great Plains, helping restore this culturally significant species to Native American communities. Visitors began arriving from around the world to witness the restoration in action. The economic impact was measurable. Hotels, restaurants, and guide services in nearby towns saw increased business. The American Serengeti that critics had mocked was becoming a reality, and it was bringing economic benefits to the very communities that had opposed it. Perhaps most importantly, the Bison Project demonstrated that large-scale ecosystem restoration was possible in the modern world. The 3.2 million acres that American Prairie Reserve was assembling, including the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge and surrounding lands, represented one of the largest intact grassland ecosystems in North America. The grasslands proved to be remarkable carbon sinks, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at rates that surprised scientists. In an era of climate change, the restored prairie was providing ecosystem services worth millions of dollars annually. Even some former critics began to acknowledge the project's success. Local newspapers that had once run editorials against the bison invasion began featuring stories about the ecological and economic benefits. Some ranchers, while still opposed to the overall vision, admitted that the animals were thriving and the land was improving. The legal challenges continued. The Montana Stockgrowers Association, Attorney General, and Governor's Office filed appeals to stop the BLM decision from being implemented. But the scientific evidence was clear, and the transformation was undeniable. By 2024, the American Prairie Reserve bison herd had grown to over 500 animals roaming across hundreds of thousands of acres. What started with 16 bison on a cold October night had become one of the most successful large-scale ecosystem restoration projects in American history. The barren plains that critics said could never support wild bison were now home to a thriving ecosystem that supported not just bison, but hundreds of other species that had been absent for over a century. The impossible vision of an American Serengeti was becoming reality, one bison at a time. The story of American Prairie Reserve proves that even the most ambitious conservation dreams can become reality when backed by science, persistence, and the courage to ignore the critics. Those 16 bison that stepped onto the Montana prairie in 2005 didn't just restore a species, they restored an entire world that everyone said was gone forever. Today, as you watch bison thunder across the Montana plains once again, it's hard to imagine that anyone ever thought this was impossible. But sometimes the most important transformations happen not despite the laughter and criticism, but because someone was willing to prove the critics wrong. The barren plains are barren no more. The American Serengeti is real. And the critics who once laughed at the impossible dream of bringing bison home are now witnessing one of the greatest conservation success stories of our time.